I have been with Strong Towns, first as a volunteer contributor to the site, and then in a content direction and editing capacity, and as well as a regular writer for the last few years. And I have a degree in urban planning with a concentration in housing and community development. So that really has been increasingly my focus for a long time. I think living in San Francisco was probably a formative thing for me in terms of my interest specifically in how do we unlock more housing opportunities in our communities, because you can't live in San Francisco and not care about that. And I was there for a number of years as things were as the insanity was building. At this point, there's no way that we could go back and live there if we wanted to. And I've kind of watched friends trickle out of that region. And I've seen some of the same things here in Florida. I've seen friends really struggle with housing, either with the cost of it or the availability of it, or with making really unpleasant trade-offs in their lives in terms of, are you going to live with roommates if you don't want to? Are you going to live in a neighborhood that really isn't conducive to the way you would like to live your life, where maybe you need a long commute, you need a couple cars as opposed to being able to get around by walking and biking. Lots of people are making those trade-offs. And so I feel really, really strongly that we need as a society to crack this nut of zoning reform, regulatory reform, as well as all the other pieces that go into making it possible for more Americans to live a good life in a prosperous place, and in a way that builds resilience all the way from their own circumstances, all the way up to the level of the neighborhood, to the level of the larger community.
I can honestly say I have never had this thought, and I think it's brilliant. Should discussions of housing focus more on income-producing housing, that is, additional bedrooms, storefronts, houses that can adapt workspaces, smaller or larger families, versus our existing approach that assumes that subsidized housing is necessary for those that can afford a regular house outright? What do you think of that?
As far as income-producing housing, I'm liking seeing the question phrased that way, because I wouldn't have thought to phrase it that way, but it really is getting at something important. I love the history of the New England triple-decker, and I've written about that history. These buildings are pervasive all over the cities of New England, especially in Boston. A lot of them sprung up between about the 1870s and the 1930s. And the thing about the triple-decker is most of these were built by people who weren't developers with a capital D. Very often it was like you were a mill owner and you were producing housing for your employees. You were a carpenter and you did it on the weekends, but then you've got these houses where, a family can own a triple decker and they live in one of the units, and, they allow a relative, someone in their extended family to live at maybe below market rent in the second unit, or maybe for free. They're housing an extended family or a friend or something. And then they got a third unit and they rent that out to a tenant at market rate, and they've got a source of income that allows them to save up. These were really, really popular with immigrants because they were like a ticket into wealth building and a ticket into the middle class. But I've talked personally to so many people who have a family history of doing this. Like, you own a duplex, you own a triplex, and it's your housing and it's a source of income. And it's a source of housing for someone else in your community or in your family. That used to be so commonplace. And we've just completely lost that notion that it was a thing you would do. And now we have these proposals that are kind of niche for things like live work studios. Well, those almost always, it's actually kind of it's a niche proposition, and it tends to be people who are much higher up on the income scale who are actually doing this, because what we don't have is the financing in place to make it something that a working class person can do. I've had it convincingly argued to me by incremental development folks, our John Anderson in Atlanta, he trains small scale developers and he knows the numbers. And he made a convincing case to me that in a low-income neighborhood, he gave me the hypothetical of the lowest income neighborhood in Sarasota, it's called Newtown. It's the historical hub of the Black community. It's a lot of really modest single-family homes on small lots. A lot of them they're older and they're in poorer condition. And he said, one of these lots in Newtown, for $150,000, you could build a house with an ADU. You can get an FHA loan to do it. That ADU becomes a source of housing for someone else in the community who really needs housing. Like, he walked me through some numbers and he was like, the problem is that the people who would benefit from this, the people who live in this neighborhood who would do it, they're not considered creditworthy. They can't get the loan to do that. There are places for the public sector to step in here and I think help with alternative sources of financing or with greasing the skids a little bit. But yeah, we need to look at what would it take to make income producing housing an option in working class communities, in low income communities where there is the need and there's the opportunity. And there are a whole bunch of places where this would actually make sense. And it is a historical model that we can look back to. I'm not against subsidized housing, but the thing that I've argued before and that I will always say is the vast majority of Americans live in market rate housing, mostly just in market rate housing that is older and it's cheaper because it's older, because it has less desirable attributes, because it's in a less desirable location. The vast majority of Americans live in market rate housing, and that's not going to change anytime soon. The numbers guarantee that that is not going to change. There is this blinkered way that we talk about affordable housing where, and I've heard this from elected officials and it drives me nuts. It's like, housing is unaffordable in our community. Therefore, the problem is that we need to build affordable housing. And by affordable, they mean only we need to build subsidized housing. Well, the other thing that's true is that 98% of Americans don't live in newly built housing. They live in used housing in the same way that you would drive a used car. The notion that we are going to solve this problem by building subsidized housing is completely mathematically illiterate. Subsidized housing is good. It fills a niche. But the scale of the shortage of housing that people can afford in places where they want to be and have opportunity is many, many times greater than the amount of subsidized housing we can build on any reasonable time horizon. So I have some familiarity with form-based codes, and I unfortunately have firsthand familiarity with a failed effort to implement one. So just, a quick definition here, just to make sure everyone's sort of on the same, up to speed to do a minimum level. A form-based code is an alternative way to structure your zoning code, as opposed to the use-based zoning that is prevalent throughout North America. A form-based code emphasizes the built form of the structures in a place rather than what is going on inside them. Are they residential? Are they commercial? Are they office, etc.? Form-based code emphasizes things, urban design characteristics. What is the setback from the street? How does the building engage the street and the sidewalk and the public realm? To some extent, architectural design standards, it can be more or less prescriptive on that, but with the idea that you want to create sort of a unified, not aesthetic, but environment where each building contributes to its broader urban environment instead of detracting from it. Form-based codes will typically regulate the bulk and the height and the massing of buildings, but within that framework, they will allow a lot more flexibility than conventional Euclidean zoning for mixing uses within a building or for being kind of agnostic as to what the use of a building is. You are not going to be prescriptive about, well, you have to be residential here and you can have a corner store on this block, but not on that one, and so on and so on. It's meant explicitly to facilitate the kind of mixed complete neighborhoods that we used to see prior to the suburban era, where the assumption was that you would want a mix of residences and businesses and workplaces in your neighborhood. And you would want to be able to live a life where you could walk between these things. The challenge, of course, is making the transition. I think the theoretical case that a form-based code is an improvement over conventional zoning, the theoretical case is really strong. The question as it was posed was, is it worth the fight? I have seen a lot of cities successfully implement form-based codes in a very limited way, often as a set of standards for one neighborhood. You'll see it in a downtown, or you'll see it in, an area where it's almost a pilot project, or where they're trying to build upon some traditional urban fabric that still exists. And very often, I'm seeing a comment actually in the chat about this from Andrew Burleson. Very often what happens is that you've got a constituency within the city, you've got staff in City Hall who are gung-ho about this, you've got elected officials who are on board, and they decide that the thing that is doable is, well, we're going to make this an overlay, a set of standards layered on top of the existing zoning in part of your city. The plus side of this is that it's usually doable as a political lift. Like, the number of people that have to be kind of on board with this is smaller. If you're doing it in your downtown district, you can get the business community, you can get the downtown improvement district on board. You can actually kind of rally the relevant stakeholders to support a plan and move forward with it. But its effectiveness, it doesn't affect your whole city. The impact becomes more limited, and it can make things more complicated because you're adding another layer of regulation. On the other hand, doing it citywide is a really, really daunting proposition. There are not a lot of good precedents for doing this successfully. Where I live in the city of Sarasota, Florida, we actually did have an effort to implement a form-based code citywide. They had sort of recognized the need for a major rewrite of the entire zoning code. Elected officials were on board. The city put together what they called their urban design studio, got a couple of high-powered designers to run it. They had this whole effort, huge public engagement process. At the end, they had done a significant amount of the work in developing a code that looked really promising. But what they hadn't done was really worked to ensure a resilient base of political support. We had some changes in who was in elected office, and we also had kind of not in my backyard constituencies that developed the idea that this was going to be, it was either going to be a giveaway to developers or it was going to invite high density and congestion and traffic and all the sort of buzzwords that you hear. And there ended up being a really monstrous backlash to the idea of the form-based code. There had been a significant amount of public engagement, but you still had people who weren't on board, and they were able to mobilize this counter narrative that the community wasn't engaged and the community doesn't support this, and this is a radical experiment. And they essentially scared the city commission by 2018 into backing off of this effort that had begun in 2014. I think the groundwork had begun earlier than that. So it ended in kind of catastrophic failure, and it actually set back some much more modest zoning reforms that we would have had because they scrapped the entire form-based code. That's a cautionary tale, but I think that this is something that is popular among a subset of urban planners, urban designers, particularly new urbanist people who kind of get what it is and get the case for it. It's not necessarily easy to communicate to the broader public. You're going to face opposition, and I think there's a huge amount of softening the ground that has to happen first before you task staffers with actually starting to write this thing. Or, in this case, simply the appearance of unaccountability, which was not the reality, was enough for opponents to mobilize and scuttle it. It's tough. I think that I'm not convinced that a full form-based code initiative like that is ever going to be the low-hanging fruit in more than, a smaller community that can maybe pull it off. The benefits are obvious, but I think there are ways to make incremental changes to your zoning code that start where you stop digging holes, you stop prohibiting good things, you start allowing, you start allowing some good things that should be allowed, and you kind of build one common sense reform on another. My sense is it's more likely to get you where you need to be. I don't know. I can see both sides of that. People ask us, which community is doing it right? Which community should we copy? And the answer is never as simple as this is the place where they're doing everything right. But I think we can pull out examples of different policy successes from here and there and learn from those. One thing that's top of mind for me, I think if you want to ask objectively in terms of the goal of legalizing more incremental housing and more infill housing, objectively speaking, the biggest numerical success story happening right now in the United States is almost certainly with accessory dwelling units in California. And in this case, what actually happened was a state law that preempted a lot of local zoning. It didn't totally overwrite it, but a state law passed in 2017 said municipalities have to allow accessory dwelling units on residential lots, and they can't erect this series of barriers to them. So you can't have onerous parking requirements applied to accessory dwelling units, where effectively, if you have a smaller lot or if you have a lot that doesn't have a rear alley, the effect of that was to make it so you can't have an ADU because there's no place to create the additional parking spot for your ADU. You can't have onerous setback requirements or height or size requirements attached to your ADU. I believe you can't require a separate sewer and water hookup from the main house, which is a really, really expensive proposition. There's a robust debate within the Strong Towns movement about state overrides of local zoning. You'll hear different takes on that. You'll hear me and Chuck Marone disagree and kind of spar over this all the time because I tend to be more sympathetic to the state overrides for resolving some of the kind of prisoner's dilemma problems involving who has to allow for more housing and where do they have to allow it. But I do think that you can look at something like what California did as it's not the state writing zoning for localities, but it is the state imposing some guardrails and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. In any case, the effect has been an explosion of ADU construction in California since 2017. There's no precedent for this in the post-war era anywhere in the United States. In Los Angeles, ADU permits went from a couple hundred a year to over 6,000 a year in the span of 3 years. Accessory dwelling units now account for more than 1/5 of all housing permits issued in LA. And you see similar results in other California cities. So that is a massive success story that everyone should be looking to. There are some other kind of success stories in the works that I think we're going to see bear more and more fruit. One is the removal of parking minimums in a rapidly growing number of cities. This is, of course, one aspect of the zoning code, but it's a really, really important aspect. Parking tends to be a really crucial linchpin. It's a crucial constraint on what you can do on a given lot, how much housing you can fit on that lot, and how affordable it can ultimately be. Like, parking really does limit that. Minneapolis is one city I'm very familiar with, where in 2018, as part of a broader suite of reforms, they abolished all parking mandates citywide. And there have been a number of kind of medium-sized, mid-rise apartment buildings developed since then with either no parking or much less parking than the previous standard would have required. It's common now for buildings to go up with like about 0.5 parking spaces per unit. In neighborhoods where there is a lot of walkability, there is a lot of transit, like the market studies support that you can do this. And people are still renting those apartments and there's demand for them. And you're seeing rents pushed down as a result of this. You're seeing more housing units than would have been possible. And similar results are trickling in other cities that have done parking reform. We have to remember that this is really, really new. The first major American city to end parking mandates was Buffalo in, I believe, 2015. It might have been 2016. This is really new, especially considering that many, many development projects are several years from initial proposal to actually completion. We're going to see more results. I could probably think of more examples, but maybe we should move on to another question here. I try to distinguish the pieces of this that are the strong towns answer from the pieces of this that are the Daniel Herriges answer, because I think we get into some issues here where reasonable people can disagree. One thing that we say a lot at strong towns, and these words come straight from Chuck, but I think it's a really powerful thing to keep in mind. Problems have solutions, predicaments have outcomes. And the housing shortage in a lot of America, and in particularly in really hot coastal markets, is a predicament. We've reached the point where, there is a 30 to 40 year backlog of meeting our housing needs, where this is a massive hole that we're in, and there is no painless way out of that hole, and there is no silver bullet way out of that hole. I reject the notion that incremental development is slow development or modest or gradual. I wrote about this in the Unleashing the Swarm series that I did. The city of Chicago in 1850 was a town of 30,000 people on the frontier. And in 1890, it was a city of 1 million. And in 1930, Chicago was a city of 3 million. And that happened overwhelmingly through incremental development. That happened through what we would recognize today as small scale developers. The city sort of laid the groundwork. The city prepared a grid as sort of a template that could just expand out and out and out. You can look at an aerial map of Chicago today and you see the march of that grid. But people were largely buying individual lots or individual blocks and building them up using these templates that they could copy over and over and over again, the 2-flat, the row house. And a lot of that work was being done by people who were sort of semi-amateur developers compared to what we have today. This proceeded really, really fast because there were templates that could be used over and over again. There were people with the skill set to do it. A lot of the people who were small scale developers in that time were people in the building trades. You were a carpenter for other people as your job, and then you also built your own house. And you had a rental unit in that house and you rented it out and had an income source, people. There was an ecosystem, an economic and cultural ecosystem to support this. And that's what we don't have. And you don't get that back overnight. So my writing on Unleashing the Swarm is all about what are all the pieces you have to do, of which regulatory reform is only a small chunk, to build back the networks of people that can rapidly build and finance and manage these kinds of projects. Many, many hands. That snowball takes a long time to get rolling. That is not an immediate solution. So I think one thing we have to do is disabuse ourselves of the notion that there is an immediate solution. And that's hard, right? Because you see the human suffering associated with the housing crisis. I lived in the Bay Area. I love the Bay Area. I have watched so many friends leave the Bay Area, people who had family there, people who it was their home, and they're just like, I can't justify continuing to live here. Working class people, especially, being pushed out. The other thing that is true is that predicaments have outcomes. Most people will find a way to get a roof over their heads. You do have huge homeless crises in these cities, and that's its own whole topic. Most people will find a way to get a roof over their head, but the way they're going to do it may be ugly and unpleasant and involve painful trade-offs. You may have overcrowding, people living in substandard conditions. You may have people living with really, really crazy commutes. You may have people finding ways to hack it in housing that really wasn't built for their needs. A lot of that is going to continue. That is one answer to the crisis. And Nolan Gray, who's a friend of ours, likes to point out that there's this juxtaposition between the number of subsidized affordable housing units permitted in New York City in the 1990s, which I believe is somewhere on the order of 15,000, and the number of informal basement apartments created in Queens in the 1990s, which is about 48,000. Most of those were illegal, but that's people subdividing their homes, creating another apartment that they can rent out because it is a source of low-cost housing. There are a lot of unused bedrooms in American cities, even really high-cost cities right now. There are a lot of unused bedrooms, and at a certain point, if the crunch is severe, people start subletting, people start living with roommates who otherwise wouldn't have lived with roommates. These are the ways that it shakes out. So I think the best we can do right now is twofold. You need the Band-Aid. You need the immediate stop the bleeding treatment. You also need the cure. The cure is going to take time, and it is recreating these systems that we used to have to produce lots of housing in lots of places by lots of hands. The Band-Aid is how can we minimize the human suffering in the meantime? I said I was going to distinguish the Strong Towns answer from the Daniel Herriges answer. I am pretty comfortable with a suite of policy solutions for minimizing the bleeding right now that include things like right to counsel for people facing eviction, just cause eviction protections, certain forms of rent stabilization to keep tenants from being priced out of their homes. I think there's a right and a wrong way to do that, because it's going to create a market distortion. And I've written about that before. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole right now. I think there is that suite of policy reforms. How can we protect people from displacement in the near term? And they are things that a lot of people who are maybe more free market minded chafe at. And I understand the reasons for chafing at it. And they are not systemic answers, but they protect people from imminent harm while we work on the systemic solution. I think people can disagree in good faith on these policies. Another piece of it is how much are we going to subsidize publicly the creation of large amounts of housing right now? And I tend to be in favor of a really robust public housing or social housing program that would mobilize government resources to create homes right now that are reserved for low-income people. There are right and wrong ways to do it, and there's a lot of nuance that I've written about that I'm not going to try to answer in this space. Again, I think reasonable people can disagree on what's the right and wrong way to go about that. I think it's important to understand that that doesn't fix the systemic issues with the market. It doesn't fix the underlying reasons for this undersupply. But depending on how aggressive you are willing to be with mobilizing public sector resources, you can help people right now. That was a long-winded answer because it's a very, very difficult. I'm not convinced that a full form-based code initiative like that is ever going to be the low-hanging fruit in more than, a smaller community that can maybe pull it off. The benefits are obvious, but I think there are ways to make incremental changes to your zoning code that start where you stop digging holes, you stop prohibiting good things, you start allowing, you start allowing some good things that should be allowed, and you kind of build one common sense reform on another. My sense is it's more likely to get you where you need to be. I don't know. I can see both sides of that.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Daniel. And I think that there's a lot of great stuff being dropped in the chat as well, which I think will be quite helpful if folks are really interested in learning more about form-based code or following up on some of the different ways and approaches that it's being done. But maybe this is a good point then for Nathan's question, which is, can you share some examples of American municipalities that are showing clearly positive results from zoning reforms to make a convincing case to my people in my city? Nathan is in Holyoke, Massachusetts. He said, I need some good examples.
Yeah, I can think of a few. And again, there's people ask us, like, which community is doing it right? Which community should we copy? And the answer is never as simple as, like, this is the place where they're doing everything right. But I think we can pull out examples of different policy successes from here and there and learn from those. One thing that is one thing that's top of mind for me, I think if you want to ask objectively in terms of the goal of legalizing more incremental housing and more infill housing. Objectively speaking, the the biggest numerical success story happening right now in the United States is almost certainly with accessory dwelling units in California. And in this case, what actually happened was a state law that preempted a lot of local zoning. It didn't totally overwrite it, but a state law passed in 2017 said municipalities have to allow accessory dwelling units on residential lots, and they can't erect this series of barriers to them. So you can't have onerous parking requirements applied to accessory dwelling units, where effectively, if you have a smaller lot or if you have a lot that doesn't have a rear alley, the effect of that was to make it so you can't have an ADU because there's no place to create the additional parking spot for your ADU. You can't have onerous setback requirements or height or size requirements attached to your ADU. I believe you can't require a separate sewer and water hookup from the main house, which is a really, really expensive proposition. There's a robust debate within the Strong Towns movement about state overrides of local zoning. You'll hear different takes on that. You'll hear me and Chuck Marone disagree and kind of spar over this all the time because I tend to be more sympathetic to the state overrides for resolving some of the kind of prisoner's dilemma problems involving who has to allow for more housing and where do they have to allow it. But I do think that you can look at something like what California did as it's not the state writing zoning for localities, but it is the state imposing some guardrails and saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. In any case, the effect has been an explosion of ADU construction in California since 2017. Like there's no precedent for this in the post-war era anywhere in the United States. In Los Angeles, ADU permits went from a couple hundred a year to over 6,000 a year in the span of 3 years. Accessory dwelling units now account for more than 1/5 of all housing permits issued in LA. And you see similar results in other California cities. So that is a massive success story that everyone should be looking to. There are some other kind of success stories in the works that I think we're going to see bear more and more fruit. One is the removal of parking minimums in a rapidly growing number of cities. This is, of course, one aspect of the zoning code, but it's a really, really important aspect. Parking tends to be a really crucial linchpin. It's a crucial constraint on what you can do on a given lot, how much housing you can fit on that lot, and how affordable it can ultimately be. Like parking really does limit that. Minneapolis is one city I'm very familiar with, where in 2018, as part of a broader suite of reforms, they abolished all parking mandates citywide. And there have been a number of kind of medium-sized, mid-rise apartment buildings developed since then with either no parking or much less parking than the previous standard would have required. It's common now for buildings to go up with like about 0.5 parking spaces per unit. In neighborhoods where there is a lot of walkability, there is a lot of transit, like the market studies support that you can do this. And people are still renting those apartments and there's demand for them. And you're seeing rents pushed down as a result of this. You're seeing more housing units than would have been possible. And similar results are trickling in other cities that have done parking reform. We have to remember that this is really, really new. The first major American city to end parking mandates was Buffalo in, I believe, 2015. It might have been 2016. This is really new, especially considering that many, many development projects are several years from initial proposal to actually completion. We're going to see more results. I could probably think of more examples, but maybe we should move on to another question here. All of these issues that plague larger towns and cities the stakes kind of get magnified when you're in a smaller town, and especially one that has a geographical constraint like you're talking about. I've never made it to Decorah. I've looked at it on Google Street View and it looks lovely. And I've always wanted to check out Decorah. I've been to some kind of similar towns in the Driftless area, and they really are in these little valleys and ravines and hollows that don't offer a lot of room for expansion. I think, again, the question becomes like, the town isn't full. Just because you're geographically constrained doesn't mean you're full, because there is always room to build more intensely. And if actually, I think all over the world, what we tend to see is that the best urbanism happens in places that are geographically constrained, because it forces walkability and it forces vitality at the street level, because people are here and they're not all the way out there. In the long run, that is an advantage for a town like that. In the short run, if you're trying to deal with an imminent crisis of there's not enough housing, it means that you really have to focus on understanding the barriers to filling in the space you've got. It's hard for me to speak to questions that are really motivated by a very specific place, because I think the particulars of that place are going to matter a lot. ADUs as an option. Yeah, like if I were living in Decorah, I would be able to make reference to specific neighborhoods or specific streets and say, and the geometry of the lots and say, this is what an ADU has to look like to be something that you could easily do on half of the residential lots in this town. And these are what the design standards need to make sure to allow. But even if you get your zoning totally right, you need to have people who are going to do it. You can have the best zoning in the world, and for other reasons, not have anyone actually want to go build an ADU. So I don't have a good answer for the particulars of a small community. And I think that's really unsatisfying, because I think issues that are policy in a big city become almost more interpersonal in a small city. Like, who is the guy in your town who knows how to build an ADU and can become the resource for everyone else who wants to do it? Like, in a small town, you're going to have the guy or the woman, or, I'm using the guy kind of as a signifier here. But in a big city, you might not have like the guy who does this thing. You're going to have, like what you see happening in cities like Portland or Austin, where whole startups have sprung up that will like design, build, and permit and finance your ADU for you. In smaller towns and rural areas, like, the solutions look different. They're much more interpersonal. They're much more ad hoc, but you have the ability to talk to people individually and find out, like, what would get you to do this? What I believe is that we need to default to approaching people and their motivations in a charitable and humble way, where we try to understand them before condemning them. I think that you have people in communities who are prejudiced, who are narrow-minded, who are bigoted. Like, those people are there, then they're often vocal. You have a lot more people who are risk averse. They're fearful. They don't have all the information. They haven't been exposed to a countervailing narrative. One of the best countervailing narratives I know is, would you like your grown children to be able to come back and live in their hometown? In California, this is really, really effective at starting better conversations with older homeowners who think, yeah, I do want that. It's about humanizing the other. It's really easy to fear the other when there's sort of an enigma or a placeholder in your mind. But I had a conversation with a relative of my wife, and this is someone I really love and really respect. And she was saying, I don't even remember how we got on the subject, but she said, would you want rental houses in your neighborhood? I don't want a rental on my street. They're not going to take care of the property. They might be loud and disrespectful. They might she gave me these reasons that were sort of rooted in fear of why I wouldn't want to live next door to a rental. I wouldn't want an apartment building in this. And I said, when you were young, did you rent? And she said, well, yeah. And I said, would you have liked to live in this neighborhood when you were in your 20s and you were renting? And she thought for a while. She got real quiet and she said, point taken. Yeah. I could have dismissed this woman who I know and love and respect as a NIMBY. But in this case, she's not. She was voicing something, and it was rooted in some risk aversion and some understandable caution, and probably in experiences that she has had. But she was persuadable. Mm-hmm. And the key to that was humanizing the consequences of what she was saying.
Daniel, thank you for helping us to understand a lot of these things. I'm excited because this content will live on as well in recorded form, so other people can find it and benefit from it as well. Thank you to everybody that participated today in the chat and just attending. That's been awesome. Daniel probably has to go because he has a whole stream of content to keep up for the Strongtown site, but I'm going to stay on for another 30, 40 minutes for our after party. So if you have time and you're not stolen away to discreetly watch this on your work break, stay on for a while and let's chat together. And thank you again to Daniel. I've seen some great comments in the chat, just how this has been appreciated. So that's great. That's great feedback. Thank you all. And can't wait for next week with Rachel Quednow. She and I were talking in advance of it, of just how being a parent has helped to really identify so many of the gaps within our built environment. When you think of what the needs of vulnerable residents are, what needs we have when we're surrounded by the fact that children aren't great decision makers. And as a consequence, we need to build environments that suit that, rather than driving them away from it. It is sad that kids don't play outside just like they used to, but there's a reason for that. And so that's going to be a core part of our topic next week. But thank you all.